The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, which was the day the post came to the Alderton house in Grosvenor Place. And Cecily Vane did not open it at once because the direction on the outer fold was addressed to Lady Alderton's companion and the housekeeper. Birch had already set it atop the morning's stack of correspondence with the dismissive efficiency of a woman who sorted the world by rank without thinking about it. Cecily was not expected to receive invitations. She was expected to convey them, to read them aloud if her ladyship's eyes were tired, to note the date in the household diary, and to remind the coachman 3 days before. She set the envelope on the corner of the writing desk and returned to her mending. She might have left it there entirely had not the footman James appeared at the door 2 hours later with a second envelope, identical in size and seal, and said with the straightforward confidence of someone repeating another man's instruction that the first had been delivered in error by the Cresthollow household, and that this one was the correct copy. Would she please return the other? Cecily looked at the two envelopes side by side. They were the same cream vellum, the same broken wax seal, dark green with the letter A pressed into it, the same direction, in the same clerk's hand. She unfolded the first one, then the second, and laid them flat on the desk. They were identical in every word. She read them both again. The Viscount Ashbourne requests the pleasure of your company at Cresthollow Park on the 14th of December, for an intimate dinner at which an announcement of familial significance will be made. The wording was formal and restrained and gave nothing further away. Cecily picked up the envelope the footman James had asked her to return and looked at the direction one more time. The ink was entirely clear. The letter formation was the same. Miss Cecily Vane, Lady Alderton's companion, Grosvenor Place. There was no ambiguity in the address. The card had not come to her by mistake. She folded the first invitation and slipped it into her left glove, where she kept small things she was not ready to set down. The footman James was still waiting. She gave him the second card and told him it had been sent in error by the house. And thank you and good day. She did not tell Lady Alderton. She sat with the question for 3 days before the carriage was ordered, and she climbed into it gloved, hand closing around the stiff fold of card inside the kid leather, and turned her face toward the window as London dissolved into November Road. She had been told at intervals since she was 19 years old that she was the practical arrangement. It was not always spoken so plainly. Sometimes it arrived as a kindness. "Cecily, you are so sensible," her cousin had said. "The sort of girl a man relies upon rather than loses his head over." Her father had confirmed it inadvertently in the year before he died, when he said she would always find her way because she was resourceful and not the kind to make trouble for herself by hoping too much. Lady Alderton had said something similar when engaging her. "I need a girl who is clear-eyed, Miss Vane, not one who is always turning the situation romantic." The world had reached a consensus about her, and the consensus was that she was not the choice. She was the consequence. The thing arrived at after the first choice had proven unavailable. She did not argue with the world's verdict. She had stopped arguing with it at 20, which was 2 years after she had understood it, and 1 year after she had tried, once, to disbelieve it. The trying had cost her something she did not name often. She had put it away along with several other things that were heavy and of no practical use. The invitation in her glove was a fact she had not yet explained to herself. She turned it over, mentally, in the way she turned difficult domestic accounts, searching for the arithmetic error, the figure that did not belong. The Viscount Ashbourne had no prior acquaintance with her. She had met him once at a summer gathering in Richmond the previous year for perhaps 4 minutes, during which he had been presented to Lady Alderton and had spoken perhaps 12 words in Cecily's direction, and she had thought only that his eyes, which were the grey of river-stone on an overcast afternoon, had rested on her face for a half-beat longer than courtesy required before he turned away. She had not made anything of it. She was not the sort who made things of such moments. She was the sort who noted them in the manner of a good housekeeper noting the silver. Present, counted, returned to the drawer. The announcement of familial significance. She watched the frozen fields pass. In December, England's countryside was the color of pewter and brown paper, beautiful in the way of things that make no concession to the eye. She thought about the second invitation, the one she had sent back, the one that had arrived after the first and been returned as the error, when it was possible. She thought it now clearly, for the first time, that it was not the error at all. She thought about Miss Arabella Vine. Everyone in the relevant circles knew about Miss Arabella Vine. The Vine family had been maneuvering toward the Ashbourne title for the better part of 2 seasons with Lady Hester Vine at the helm, a woman whose social intelligence was as cold and precise as a surveyor's instrument. Arabella was 21, handsome in the manner of a woman who had been told her entire life that she was handsome, and had organized herself around the information, accomplished on the pianoforte, polished a conversation, and possessed of a family fortune that complemented the Ashbourne estate in the practical way that solicitors noted approvingly in correspondence. She was the correct choice. She was exactly what the season had decided Lord Ashbourne required. Cecily knew this the way she knew the household calendar, documented and factual and having very little to do with her. She arrived at Crest Hollow in the early afternoon, when the light was already doing that particular English December thing of abandoning the sky while the clock said it was not yet 3. The estate rose out of the beech trees on the left side of the road. Gray stone, generous windows, 3 wings arranged around a courtyard that someone had planted with late-season evergreen, and a single dormant rose arch. It was a house that had been lived in properly, which meant it showed its age without apology. The beech trees had dropped their leaves and the avenue was bare, and the cold came in at the carriage window as the door was held open, carrying the particular smell of frost on old stone that Cecily associated with the English countryside in its honest season. Cecily watched the house settle into view and felt the peculiar sensation she had felt at the desk, with the 2 envelopes, which was not excitement exactly, but the specific attention one gave to a problem that had more dimensions than it first appeared. A man was waiting on the gravel. As the carriage slowed, he was perhaps 50, in a dark coat, with the bearing of someone who managed things on behalf of others and was precise about the distinction between his authority and theirs. He introduced himself as Mr. Graves, the estate's steward, and he welcomed Lady Alderton with the warmth of a man who had expected her. He welcomed Cecily with the warmth of a man who had not. And the companion, he said, with the flat attentiveness of a man noting an entry in a ledger. Not Miss Vane, the companion. As though the category were sufficient, as though Cecily were interchangeable with whichever other young woman had last occupied the role. He turned back to Lady Alderton at once, and began to speak of dinner arrangements. Cecily stepped down from the carriage without assistance. The step was higher than expected, and she managed it without difficulty, but she became aware as she set her foot on the gravel that someone was watching the management of it. She looked up in the doorway of the east wing. Very still against the pale stone was the Viscount Ashbourne. He was taller than she remembered him from Richmond, and the tailcoat was the dark navy of deep water in lamplight, and he was watching her with the specific quality of attention that a person gives to something they have been waiting to see confirmed. He did not smile. He did not look away. Then Mr. Graves stepped into his sightline, and the Viscount's gaze transferred, and the moment was over, efficiently and without ceremony, and Cecily carried it inside her with the same care with which she carried the invitation in her glove. If you find this story settling into something you did not expect, stay a little while longer. It earns what it spends. The interior of Crest Hollow was warm in the way of houses that are heated by habit rather than by effort. The fires laid at consistent intervals, the candles in their sconces replaced before they burned too low. A maid named Agnes showed Cecily to her room, which was a corner room in the guest wing, with a window overlooking the south garden, and a fireplace that had been lit an hour prior. It was not the largest guest room. It was the sort of room that had been chosen with a degree of thought, which was to say, it was comfortable without being prominent. And Cecily noticed the small acts of care, the extra blanket, the writing paper on the desk, the pitcher of warm water, in the way she noticed most things in service households, which was quietly. She changed her dress, and came down to the lower corridor when the bell rang for the household tea that preceded formal dinner, and it was in that lower corridor, moving from the servants' hall toward the front passage, that she heard Mr. Forthivac Graves speak to the under-butler. She was not meant to hear it. The corridor made a turn, and she had stopped at the turn because she heard her name, or rather she heard the phrase that Mr. Graves used in place of her name, which was the wrong Miss. Lady Alderton brought the wrong Miss, Mr. Graves said, with the mild irritation of a man correcting a domestic inconvenience. Miss Vane was not to have been included. It is Miss Vine who has been expected these 3 weeks. Lady Alderton has confused the situation entirely, or the household correspondence was handled without sufficient care. In any case, the wrong Miss is here, and we shall have to manage it. The under-butler said something brief and deferential. Mr. Graves said that he supposed it made no material difference to the dinner. The announcement would proceed as arranged, and Miss Vane could be seated at the far end and no one need address her particularly. Cecily stood at the turn of the corridor for the length of 3 slow breaths. She did not move until she was certain the voices had retreated. She pressed her left hand briefly against her gloved right, feeling the card through both layers, then walked forward into the passage with her chin level and her expression, she made certain, entirely composed. It was on the 3rd evening, the afternoon before the formal dinner at which the announcement was to be made, that Cecily went down to the servants' passage near the kitchen to ask Agnes about the arrangement of the table, because no one had told her anything directly, and she preferred to know things rather than to be surprised by them. The passage was narrow and stone-flagged and smelled of warm bread and lamp oil and the specific cold that seeped under old exterior doors, and she came around the passage corner and found Agnes already there, very still, being addressed by one of the senior footmen in the low certain voice of someone who had determined a fault and intended it to be felt. The fault, as far as Cecily could gather in the 3 seconds she stood still and understood the situation, was a tray. A tray that Agnes had set down on the hall table instead of the sideboard, and the footman was explaining to her in the manner of a man recounting a personal affront that a girl in Agnes's position who made such errors in a household receiving distinguished company would not long remain in that position. Agnes was perhaps 16. She was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who had learned that the safest response to authority was to offer no surface to grip. Cecily stepped forward. She said, in the pleasant, specific tone of a woman who was entirely comfortable with herself in this corridor, that she believed the tray had been set on the hall table at her instruction, as she had asked Agnes to bring it there for her own convenience, and Agnes had done exactly as asked. She looked at the footman steadily. She said she hoped that clarified the matter. The footman looked at her. He was weighing something, the calculus of rank, of guest versus servant, of what it cost to challenge a woman who had spoken with that particular composure. He decided the cost was greater than the victory. He said he understood and withdrew. Agnes looked up. Cecily said quietly that the sideboard was the correct place for trays, and she should carry on as she had been taught, and Agnes said, "Yes, miss," in a voice that was 2 degrees steadier than it had been before, and that was the end of it. Cecily did not know that Elliot Ashbourne had entered the passage from the far door a half-minute before she had rounded the corner from her side, and that he had stood in the shadow of the door-frame and watched the entire exchange from start to finish without moving. He did not announce himself. He went back the way he had come. He was a man who had learned, at significant personal cost, to be careful about the things he believed about people before he had sufficient evidence, and he had just received evidence of a quality that he had not encountered often. He held it with the deliberate care of a man who is afraid that if he examines it too closely, it will turn out to be something other than what he thinks it is. The library at Crest Hollow was a room that had accumulated books over 3 generations without imposing a system on them, which meant that histories of the Peninsular War stood beside volumes on agricultural drainage and bound collections of sermons and a complete set of someone's grandfather's correspondence wrapped in brown paper and placed on the 3rd shelf from the floor, as though the grandfather had been set to rest there. The fire was lit in the mornings. By afternoon, It had settled to a steady, low warmth, and the room smelled of coal and old paper and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco from previous inhabitants. Cecily went there on the morning of the second full day, because Lady Alderton had a headache and required no companionship, and because the library was the sort of place where a woman could sit for an hour without anyone finding a task to assign her. She chose a chair by the window and opened a volume of English topography and read 3 pages without taking them in, and then let the book rest in her lap and looked at the room. There was a portrait above the secondary fireplace, a small one in a gilt frame, turned to face the wall. She did not reach for it. She was not in the habit of handling other people's objects. She was looking at it when Agnes came in to lay the afternoon fire, and something in her expression must have asked the question, because Agnes said, setting down the coal scuttle, that it was Mr. Dorinda Channing, that was all, and that his lordship had put it face about himself 8 years ago and that no one touched it now. Agnes said it in the tone of someone repeating an established domestic fact, and then she laid the fire and left. Cecily sat with the information the way she had sat with the 2 envelopes. She turned it. 8 years ago. Dorinda Channing. She knew the name, distantly, from the edges of social memory, a girl who had been betrothed, or nearly so, to Lord Ashbourne, and then was not, and then was married to someone else entirely, a Cheshire man, and the season had discussed it for approximately 1 quarter before moving to newer business. Cecily had been 15 at the time. She had not been in a position to attend to it. She attended to it now, in the Crest Hollow library, with the turned portrait above the cold fireplace. And she thought about a man who had been chosen provisionally, and then not chosen at all, and who had put the evidence of it to the wall rather than to the fire. It said something she did not have the right words for yet, though she recognized it in the specific way one recognizes a room one has never entered, but has heard described from childhood. He had been the arrangement, the practical choice. And then the first choice had returned available, and the arrangement had been set aside, and he had not put the portrait away because it was painful, though it was that, certainly, but because it was evidence of something he had decided was true about himself, and a man who has organized his life around a piece of evidence does not burn it. He keeps it turned to the wall where he can know it is there. She closed the topography book. She held her left hand in her right for a moment, feeling the card inside the glove, the fold of it stiff and creased from 9 days of carrying. The fire had burned low. Outside the library windows, the December afternoon had gone dark while she sat, and the room was quieter than it had been, and she was in it alone with a fact she had not asked for and did not know what to do with, and was not, she admitted now, entirely prepared to set down. Then she went upstairs. She might have left after that. She thought about it. The carriage could be ordered on a pretext. Lady Alderton's headache had worsened. There was a prior engagement in town. Any number of domestic fictions available to a companion who needed to remove herself from an inconvenient situation. She sat on the edge of her bed and considered the inconvenience carefully. As she had been trained by circumstance to consider most things, she had been called the wrong miss. She was here at a dinner where an announcement of familial significance was to be made, and the announcement concerned a man who had sent her an invitation. She still believed this. The arithmetic of it held. And the announcement almost certainly concerned a woman who was not her. She was in possession of a fact that no one had asked her to have. She was inconvenient in a specific and undeniable way. She stayed. She was not entirely certain why, except that she had spent a long time removing herself from situations before they could remove her, and she was tired of the motion of it. Lord Ashbourne found her in the East Corridor that evening, which was not difficult, as the East Corridor was the only route between the guest wing and the drawing room where the party was gathering before dinner. He came from the direction of the study, and she came from the direction of the stair, and they arrived at the corridor's intersection with the particular awkwardness of 2 people who had been moving in opposite directions and had each intended to be somewhere else. He stopped. He looked at her with the gray riverstone eyes, and said nothing for what felt, in the compressed arithmetic of a hallway, like a considerable time. "You will take cold without a wrap," he said finally. "There is a draught at the drawing-room door. Come." He turned and walked, and she followed because what else did one do? and she noticed that he slowed very slightly as they reached the drawing-room threshold so that she could walk through the door ahead of him. And she noticed that he positioned himself between her and the draught from the far window, without appearing to. And she noticed that when Lady Hester turned from the fireplace and registered Cecily's presence with a very specific narrowing of attention, Lord Ashbourne's gaze had already moved to Lady Hester, and was very still and very level in the way of a man who has calculated something and is waiting without any particular agitation for it to be confirmed. Lady Hester was not a cartoonish woman. She was a woman who understood the period's social machinery with the precision of someone who had operated it for 30 years, and found it reliably effective. She wore dark red silk and pearls that were real, and a smile that was warm in the way of hearths in houses where the warmth is rationed. She received Cecily with a graciousness that said everything about what she thought of Cecily by the care with which the graciousness did not quite include her. "Miss Vane," she said, with the slight rise of a woman recovering a name she had been required to learn, "Lady Alderton's companion. How kind of you to attend." The phrasing was correct. The placement of the kindness was surgical. She turned at once to Arabella, who stood at her side in ice-blue silk, arranged with the absolute assurance of a woman who had been told since childhood that the room was hers, and said something warm and particular to her daughter. And Arabella's answering smile was a thing of polish and genuine ease and considerable beauty. The dinner at Cresthollow seated 12. Cecily was placed, as Mr. Graves had indicated to the under-butler she would be. At the far end of the table, Lord Ashbourne sat at the head. Arabella sat at his right. The arrangement was clear to anyone who understood how to read a table, which was everyone present. Cecily ate the first course and noted the quality of the silver, and listened to the conversation around her, and was, in the main, not addressed. She was accustomed to this. She had learned in 2 years, as a companion, to be present without asserting presence, to exist in a room without making any particular claim on it. She did it now with the practiced ease of a woman for whom it had become, if not comfortable, at least familiar. Toward the middle of the second course she became aware that Lord Ashbourne had looked at her twice, not with the evaluating attention of a host checking that a guest was provided for, with the specific still quality of someone who was thinking about something and finding it located unaccountably in her direction. She did not look back. She attended to her plate. Mr. Graves rose to address the table between the second and third courses, which was irregular, as formal announcements of this nature were ordinarily made after dessert. But Mr. Graves was a man who liked to manage the sequence of things, and he had apparently decided that the announcement would be made before the Chablis was poured, so that the Chablis could be drunk in celebration, and he cleared his throat with the comfortable authority of a man who had served this family for 20 years and knew his place in it precisely. "My lord," he said, addressing the head of the table. "With your permission," he produced a document from his breast pocket. The paper was folded. The seal on it was green wax, the same as the invitation. He began to speak of the honor of the Ashbourne family, and the long regard between the two houses and the happy occasion of the announcement, and the table arranged its faces into the attentive warmth of people who had anticipated this and were prepared to welcome it. Cecily looked at her plate. The invitation in her glove felt very immediate suddenly. It pressed against her left hand with the specific weight of a fact that was about to be rendered irrelevant. "The wrong miss is still at table," Lady Hester said, quietly and clearly. And into a half-second silence before Mr. Graves had begun his next sentence. She did not look at Cecily. She looked at Lady Alderton, with the gentle, particular precision of a woman explaining a domestic irregularity to the person responsible for it. One does wonder, with the confusion of correspondence. She smiled. Companions so rarely receive invitations of this nature. The silence that followed was not long. It was perhaps 5 seconds. It was entirely sufficient. Cecily did not move. She was aware of her hands on the table, one gloved, one not. She was aware of Lady Alderton's small, distressed intake of breath. She was aware of Arabella looking into the middle distance, with the careful expression of a woman who had decided the most gracious response to awkwardness was to pretend it was not occurring. She was aware most particularly of Lord Ashbourne. She had been trying not to look at him since Mr. Graves rose. She looked now. He was very still. His right hand, which had been at the stem of his glass, had been set flat on the table, and his face was the face of a man who had arrived at a decision before the question had finished being asked, which was not the face she had expected, and which arranged itself, in the available light from the candelabra, into something she did not have a word for but recognized at a physical level before her mind had processed it. Mr. Graves said something further. Lord Ashbourne did not look at Mr. Graves. He looked at Cecily, and then he looked at Lady Hester, and then he said, in the level, quiet voice that Cecily had heard him use in the corridor when it had sounded like a command and turned out to be something else entirely, "I will speak, Graves." "Thank you." Mr. Graves sat. He did it with the controlled surprise of a man who had just heard something happen that was not in his arrangement. The table was silent. The candles were the only motion in the room. Lord Ashbourne stood. He was very composed. His composure was the composure of a man who had found after a period of absence the precise solid thing that had been missing from the architecture of himself, and who was going to name it now in public, because naming it privately was no longer sufficient. He said, "Miss Vane received the correct invitation. I sent it myself." The silence after those words was of a different quality from the silence before them. Lady Hester's hand, which had been moving her wine-glass a centimeter to the left in a small habitual gesture, stopped. Arabella looked at the table with the particular expression of a woman reassembling an understanding she had believed to be complete. "Mr. Tay." Graves held his document in both hands with the air of a man who had discovered that the document concerned a different arrangement from the one he had been coordinating for 3 weeks. Cecily heard nothing beyond his voice, not because she had ceased to hear the room, but because the room had organized itself, in the space of 11 words, into a different shape from the shape it had been in before, and she required a moment to inhabit the new geometry of it. He did not look at Lady Hester. He did not look at Mr. Graves. He looked at Cecily in the way he had looked at her in the corridor, which was to say without the intermediate social language that men in his position habitually used, which was to say directly and with the still, specific quality of attention that her body had recognized before her mind permitted it to, and she thought, with the slow clarity of someone finally naming the arithmetic error she had been searching for in an account. "There it is." He crossed the room to her end of the table. Not quickly. With the measured pace of a man who has decided something and intends the decision to be witnessed, and is in no particular haste about the witnessing, he stopped at her chair. He offered his hand, not the social gesture of escorting a lady to her feet, but an open hand at the edge of the table, palm up, in the uncomplicated manner of a man presenting what he is. She looked at it. She looked up at him. She drew her left glove from her hand, slowly. She took the invitation card from inside it and laid it on the table between them. White against white linen, and she let him see it. The first one. The one she had been carrying for 9 days in the fold of a glove. His eyes dropped to it. Something moved in his face that was not, quite, the controlled composition he wore for public occasions, and it was gone before it could be named. But Cecily had seen it and would remember it always, which was that it looked very much like relief. She put her hand in his. "Mr. Plank." Selden, who was the Ashbourne solicitor, and who had been seated at the table in his professional capacity to witness and record whatever arrangements the evening produced, made a note in the small book he carried in his breast pocket. He was a careful man. He wrote exactly what he had seen and heard, which was sufficient to constitute a public declaration by any standard the law required, and he sealed his note and addressed it to himself, to be opened when the formal documents were prepared. Lady Hester said something to Arabella, very quiet, that no one heard. Arabella answered in an equally quiet voice, and the answer had the quality, though no one caught the words of composure, that had been genuinely earned rather than performed, which was the most anyone could ask of a person in such a moment. They did not remain for the third course. Lady Alderton, who had been present for all of this and who was a woman of acuity underneath the headaches, said nothing for a full minute, and then said to the person nearest her that she had always thought Cecily an exceptional young woman, which was not entirely what she had said in the past. But the past was past, and the evening was still young enough to carry the revision gracefully. The morning room at Crest Hollow received the early light through windows that faced southeast, which meant that on a December morning the sun arrived at an angle, pale and thin and particular, and lay across the wooden floors in long flat lines that moved almost imperceptibly as the morning progressed. The fire had been lit before 7. By 8 the room was warm. Outside snow had fallen in the night, a thin covering, and it lay on the garden in the silence of new things that have not yet been disturbed. Cecily sat in the chair nearest the window. Her left glove was on the table. The invitation card was beside it, unfolded at last, lying flat in the winter light. Elliot sat across from her. He had been there since 7:30, when he had come down to find the room empty, and she had arrived 6 minutes later and found him standing at the fireplace with his hands behind his back, and the particular expression of a man who had been awake for some time. They had not talked. Immediately there was a specific pleasure, Cecily was discovering, in being in a room with a person and not being required to account for the room. He had told her about the portrait, and Dorinda, in the quiet way he told her most things, which was in plain declarative sentences, with no request for pity and no performance of composure, because the composure was genuine. He had been 27 too. He had believed it was the right thing, and then been shown it was not, and had spent 8 years understanding that the two facts were not in contradiction, that a thing could be right in the choosing and still not be right in the having, and that this did not mean he had been wrong to choose. What it had meant, in practice, was that he had not chosen again. He had managed the estate. He had been a responsible guardian to his young cousin. He had attended the season with the expression of a man attending to an obligation, and had gone home each autumn with no particular sense of having failed at anything specific. He had seen her in Richmond. He had spoken 12 words to her, which was more than he intended, and had thought about her after with the specific involuntary quality of a thought that returns without invitation. He had encountered her name in Lady Alderton's correspondence with his own household 3 months later, when the question of the dinner at Crest Hollow was being arranged, and had understood the coincidence with the slow, precise attention of a man who does not believe in the category. He had addressed the invitation himself. He had given it to the footman with instructions he had thought were clear. "James told you it was an error," Cecily said. This was not an accusation. She was confirming the arithmetic. James was repeating Mr. Graves, Elliot said. Graves had been managing the Vine arrangement for 3 weeks by that point, and was not pleased to find a variable that had not been in his planning. "And the second card," Cecily said, "was sent by Graves. Yes, in my name, without my instruction." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have been more direct from the start." "You were direct last night," Cecily said, "in front of 12 people, and Mr. Selden." Something moved in his face that she recognized now as the thing she had seen in the dining room. The relief underneath. The composure. And he said, "Graves will require replacing." "I imagine he will," Cecily said. She looked at the invitation card in the morning light. She picked it up and read it again, which she had done 3 times now, and each time the words arranged themselves into their plain meaning with a clarity that surprised her, which was that they were addressed to her, specifically and deliberately, and that an announcement of familial significance had been precisely what they promised, and that the announcement had been made. She had been called the wrong miss by a man in a corridor, and by a woman at a dinner table, and in a hallway she had overheard a footman repeat the phrase to a kitchen girl, who had then looked at Cecily, with the specific sympathy of the domestic world, for the person at the edge of an arrangement. She had carried all 3 of those moments in the fold of her glove alongside the card, and now the card was on the table in the morning light, and the other things could be set down. "I spent some time in the library," she said. "Agnes told me," he said. He was looking at his hands. "The portrait," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire settled. Outside, the snow in the garden lay in its thin new silence. He said, "I kept it because I thought it was the truth. Not because it was painful, or not only because of that. He paused. I am not certain when I stopped believing it entirely. Cecily looked at him. She thought about the miniature turned to the wall, not burned, not given away, kept where it could be known without being seen. And she thought about a man who had believed a thing about himself, and had tested the belief carefully and slowly and against significant evidence before he was willing to revise it. And she thought that this was, of all the things she had learned about Elliot Ashbourne in the course of 5 days, the thing she respected most entirely. You could take it down, she said. Yes, he said. He did not say he would. He did not need to. She knew he would. She knew the precise quality of a decision that had already been made in the interior, and was simply waiting for the correct moment to be moved into action, because she had made most of her own decisions the same way. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers. Not the open-palmed gesture from the dining room, which had been for the room and for the witnesses, and for the thing that needed to be seen. This was smaller. His thumb moved once across her knuckles in the way of a man who does not often make this kind of gesture, and is not performing it, which was how she knew it was real. She turned her hand under his and held it. The snow in the south garden had begun to melt at the edges where it caught the rising morning light through the southeast window. Agnes brought tea at 8:30 and set it on the table and did not speak, because Agnes was 16 and had been in service long enough to understand when a room did not need additional things. She went out again and closed the door softly. The invitation card lay on the table between the glove and the teapot, white against the pale linen, its creases worn from 9 days in a kid leather glove, its words still entirely legible in the winter morning light. Cecily looked at it once more, then looked away, toward the window and the garden and the quiet that had settled over Crest Hollow in the early morning, the way all good and lasting things settle, without announcement, without ceremony, already complete. If you stayed until the end of Cecily's story, leave a word below for the invitation. She almost gave back,